Welcome back to Hexes, Haunts, and Howls. I'm your host, Cupcake. Today is episode 7 of A through Z of Haunted America, a series where we explore the strange, eerie, and mysterious corners of America. Tonight, we're taking our journey through Connecticut, a place that doesn't shout its hauntings, it whispers them. Connecticut is one of the oldest settled regions in the United States. Long before it became known for its ivy-covered schools, old money, and quiet shoreline towns, it was shaped by fear. Deeply religious fear. Fear of illness, fear of the unknown, fear of anything that didn't fit neatly into Puritan belief. This was a land settled by people who believed the world was watched constantly. By God, by spirits, by forces they don't fully understand. Every failed crop, every sudden illness, every unexplained death had meaning. And often, that meaning was dangerous. Medical knowledge was primitive. Infection looked like possession. Mental illness looked like sin. Grief looked like guilt. And isolation made everything worse. Homes were scattered. Winters were brutal. Communities were small, observant, and unforgiving. Connecticut didn't need grand spectacles to create horror. It created it quietly, in family homes, in forest paths, in whispered accusations, and in the slow unraveling of people who had nowhere to run. That's why Connecticut is one of the most quietly haunted states in America. Not because it has the most ghosts, but because it has some of the oldest wounds. As we move through this episode, you'll hear the same themes repeating again and again. Generational land trauma, land that passed from family to family, carrying stories no one wanted to report. Places where tragedy wasn't a single event, but a pattern. Secrecy and isolation. Communities that closed ranks. Towns that completely erased themselves. Families that never spoke about what happened and never truly escaped it. And perhaps the most unsettling of all, respectable horror. Connecticut's darkness doesn't live in ruins alone. It lives behind manicured lawns, behind historic plaques, behind wealth, education, and tradition. Horror that learned how to behave, how to dress well, how to stay hidden. This is a state where the past is never fully buried, just politely ignored. But tonight, we're going to listen for what it left behind. Let's begin. Long before Salem became synonymous with witch hysteria, fear had already taken root in Connecticut, decades earlier. In fact, the first recorded execution for witchcraft in the American colonies didn't happen in Massachusetts. It happened here. In 1647, a woman named Elsie Young was hanged in the town of Windsor. Her crime was simple and terrifyingly vague. She was accused of witchcraft. No surviving records tell us exactly what she did. There's no dramatic confession, no detailed testimony, just a single chilling line in history confirming her execution. And that silence tells us almost everything we need to know. Because in colonial Connecticut, accusations didn't need spectacle. They didn't need hysteria in the streets. They didn't need screaming crowds. They needed agreement. Witchcraft accusations here were usually rooted in everyday suffering. A child fell ill, a cow stopped producing milk, a wound wouldn't heal, and when early medicine failed, which it often did, fear stepped in to fill the gap. Illness became evidence. Misfortune became motive, and suspicion found a target. Property disputes were another spark. Land mattered. Survival depended on it. When boundaries were questioned or inheritances challenged, accusations could surface with frightening convenience. Calling someone a witch wasn't just a moral judgment. It was a way to remove a problem. And more often than not, those accused were women who didn't conform. Women who spoke too freely. Women who lived alone. Women who didn't grieve the right way. Women whose knowledge of herbs, of birth, of healing made others uneasy. In Connecticut, witch trials unfolded quietly. Local courts handled them. Neighbors testified. Ministers advised. Executions happened without fanfare. No mass panic. No sudden collapse of order. Which is exactly why they're so unsettling. When people talk about witch trials, they often compare everything to Salem. Salem was loud, chaotic, brief. Its horror burned bright and fast. Connecticut's witch panic was slower, more controlled. It stretched across decades. Accusations rose and fell without ever fully stopping. Somewhere between 30 and 40 people were accused here. At least 11 were executed. And because it never exploded, it was easier to forget. But folklore suggests the land didn't forget. Stories persist of cursed properties, farms that failed generation after generation, homes plagued by illness, families marked by tragedy that seem to follow bloodlines rather than addresses. Some locals believe certain land remembers the fear it was fed. That places where accusations were made, even without executions, still carry a residue, a tension, a watchfulness. Not all hauntings wear sheets or rattle chains. Some are quieter. A sense of being judged. A feeling you don't belong. A heaviness that settles without explanation. In Connecticut, witch panic wasn't an interruption of daily life. It was daily life. And that makes its ghosts harder to see and harder to escape. Because when fear becomes routine, it doesn't end when the trails stop. There are places that feel empty, and then there are places that feel absent, like something left before it was finished with you. Dudleytown is one of those places. Founded sometime in the mid-1700s, Dudleytown was a small settlement tucked deep into the hooded hills of northwestern Connecticut. It wasn't large, it wasn't prosperous, but for a time, it was home. Families built houses, cleared land, raised children, and expected to grow old there. They didn't. By the early 1800s, Dudleytown was completely abandoned. No celebration, no relocation plans, just gone. What followed was a story pieced together from fragments, records, folklore, and whispers passed down by people who learned not to linger. The most common explanation ties Dudleytown to the Dudley family itself. According to legend, the family was cursed long before they ever set foot in America. Some versions trace the curse back to England, involving betrayal, execution, and a warning that the Dudley name would never know peace. When members of the family settled in the valley, tragedy followed. Stories describe sudden madness, people who became withdrawn, paranoid, or violent without warning. Others speak of disappearances, residents who walked into the forest and were never seen again. There are accounts of suicide, of families torn apart by loss and fear. And slowly, one by one, they left. No single disaster explains the abandonment. No fire, no plague, just an accumulation of unbearable weight. Skeptics point to environmental causes. Dudleytown sat in a valley with poor sunlight. Crops struggled. Illness spread easily. The isolation alone could have been enough to erode mental health. Seasonal affective disorder, malnutrition, untreated illness, all plausible explanations. And yet, people who visit the area often say the same thing. It doesn't feel neutral. Even today, hikers report sudden dread, disorientation, a sense of being watched. Some describe feeling unwelcome, not threatened exactly, but noticed, as if the land itself is aware of their presence and doesn't approve. There are no standing buildings left, just stone foundations swallowed by moss and leaves. The forest has reclaimed everything, and still, it feels crowded. That's the unsettling part. Abandoned places usually feel open, exposed. Dudleytown feels closed, like a door that was shut deliberately and never reopened. Psychologically, abandonment carries weight. When a place is left all at once, without ceremony, without closure, it creates questions that cannot be answered. Why didn't they fight harder? Why didn't anyone return? What happened that made everyone agree to leave? Human minds fill those gaps. And folklore grows best in silence. Whether Dudleytown was undone by curse, environment, or the slow collapse of hope, the result is the same. A community erased, not by violence, but by attrition. Fear that didn't explode, but seeped in until leaving felt like the only option. Some believe places like Dudleytown don't haunt people. They haunt choices. They remind us how fragile stability is, how easily isolation can turn inward, how a place can stop feeling like shelter and start feeling like a warning. And maybe that's why Dudleytown still feels wrong to be in. Not because something terrible is happening there now, but because something terrible already happened. And no one stayed to tell the whole story. Cemeteries are quite often treated as static places. Quiet, finished, sealed off from the present. But some are anything but. Union Cemetery is considered one of the most documented haunted cemeteries in the United States. Not because of rumor alone, but because of consistency. Over decades, people who've never met, never spoken, and never compared notes have reported the same thing. The same figure, in the same place, doing the same thing. She's known simply as the White Lady. Witnesses describe a full-bodied apparition, not a mist or shadow. She appears as a woman dressed in white, often seen walking among the graves or standing near the tree line. Sometimes she moves slowly. Sometimes she's motionless. But almost always, she's solid enough to mistake for a living person. At least at first. What makes these sightings unsettling is how many involve multiple witnesses at once. Groups of people seeing her simultaneously, pointing, describing the same posture, the same movement, the same moment when realization sets in and fear follows. Photos taken at Union Cemetery have added fuel to the legend. Some show unexplained light anomalies. Others appear to capture vague human forms where no one was standing. Skeptics argue lens flare, dust, or long exposure. Believers point out how often the images align with eyewitness reports from the same locations. And then there are the investigators. Union Cemetery drew the attention of Ed and Lorraine Warren, who visited the site multiple times. Lorraine, known for her claims of clairvoyance, stated she sensed a female spirit tied to grief, not violence. A presence that lingered rather than lashed out. That distinction matters. The White Lady isn't known for chasing people or causing harm. She's quiet, observant, almost mournful, which raises a question that doesn't have an easy answer. Why stay? Skeptics offer reasonable explanations. Confirmation bias. The power of suggestion. A location made famous by ghost stories naturally attracts people primed to see something unusual. And cemeteries, by their nature, heighten emotion. Darkness, silence, expectation, all powerful ingredients. But even skeptics often admit something about Union Cemetery feels active. One possible reason lies in the history of continuous burials. Unlike abandoned graveyards, Union Cemetery has been in near constant use for centuries. Death didn't stop there. Grief didn't stop there. The living continued to arrive with fresh loss year after year. Some paranormal researchers believe places like this carry layered emotional energy. Not a single tragedy replaying itself, but they accumulated. Generations of mourning, of unfinished goodbyes, of people standing in the same soil, saying the same words, feeling the same ache. If hauntings exist, these would be the ideal conditions. The White Lady may not be one person at all. She could be a symbol, a manifestation shaped by expectation and memory. Or she could be exactly what she appears to be, a woman who never fully left the place where she was remembered. And that's where belief and skepticism meet. Because even if you dismiss ghosts entirely, Union Cemetery still tells a story about how humans process death, how we return to certain places again and again, binding memory to location until the two become inseparable. Maybe the White Lady isn't proof of the supernatural. Maybe she's proof that some places never stop being visited, even when the visitors change. And when a place is not allowed to rest, why should anything else? The coastline changes how people experience fear. Inland, fear hides in trees and in abandoned homes. But along the water, fear drifts. It echoes. It waits. Along the shores of New London and the surrounding coastal towns, ghost stories don't usually involve violent apparitions or sudden shocks. They involve absence, ships that never returned, sailors who said goodbye and were never seen again. The sea is especially cruel that way. For centuries, Connecticut's coast was shaped by maritime life. Fishing vessels, trade ships, naval traffic. And with them came storms, collisions, fires, and shipwrecks. Many of the dead were never recovered. No bodies, no graves, just names carved later, if at all. And that kind of loss doesn't resolve cleanly. Locals have spoken of phantom sailors seen near docks late at night. Figures standing where ships once tied up, staring out towards the water. Others describe voices carried in the wind, calling names no one present recognizes. Not shouting, not crying, just waiting. Lighthouses, meant to guide the living safely home, became another focal point for these stories. One of the most infamous is the New London Ledge Lighthouse. Built in the early 1900s, it was operated by keepers who lived in near total isolation, surrounded by water and fog. Stories tell of a former keeper who died on site and never truly left. Visitors and caretakers have reported doors opening on their own, footsteps echoing through empty rooms, and the sensation of being watched, not aggressively, but attentively, as if the lighthouse is still being tended long after it was supposed to be automated and silent. And then there are the shipwrecks. Some fishermen claim that on certain nights, when the fog settles low and the water is unusually calm, they can hear bells ringing out of nowhere. Others report seeing lights bobbing in the distance. Not buoys, not boats. Lights that vanish when approached. The sea carries sound in a strange way. At night, especially, it bends and stretches it. A voice can travel far, a memory even further. That's why maritime hauntings often feel different from land-based ones. They're less about place and more about passage. Loss without bodies creates unfinished deaths. No final sight, no certainty. Families waited on shore for ships that never appeared on the horizon. Some waited for years. Some never stopped listening. And when enough people listen long enough, the coastline remembers. Whether these experiences are spirits, sound distortion, or the mind filling silence with meaning, almost doesn't matter. The effect is the same. A sense that something is still moving just beyond visibility. Still traveling. Still trying to return. The ocean doesn't keep records. It doesn't offer closure. And it rarely gives anything back. Which makes it the perfect place for stories that refuse to end. Because when death happens far from shore, the hauntings don't always stay at sea. Every state has a creature people hesitate to talk about. Not because it's unbelievable, but because it's too close to something real. In Connecticut, that creature is known as the melonheads. They're not officially recognized cryptids. You won't find them neatly cataloged in field guides. But they are, without question, the most frequently reported cryptid-like figures in this state's folklore. Descriptions are strikingly consistent. Small humanoid beings, oversized heads, disproportionately large, almost bulbous, pale skin, thin limbs, and behavior that ranges from evasive to aggressive. Witnesses often describe seeing them dart across roads late at night, watching from the tree line, or appearing suddenly near abandoned areas. Encounters are brief, jarring, and rarely repeated in the same way. Hotspots tend to cluster around wooded areas and abandoned roads, particularly in Fairfield County, places where darkness feels deeper than it should, and where people don't expect to run into anyone at all. What makes the melonheads disturbing isn't just how they look. It's what people think they are. One of the most common origin theories claims these were once patients, escaped residents of old asylums or institutions that housed the unfit. According to the story, they fled into the forest generations ago and survived by isolation, their appearance changing over time due to malnutrition, illness, or untreated medical conditions. Another version ties them to inbred colonial families. Communities pushed so far to the margins that they disappeared from records, but not from memory. Families who lived off the land, avoided outsiders, and passed down fear along with genetics. And then there's the theory people lower their voices for. Government experiments. Stories of secret medical testing of children subjected to experimental treatments. Of facilities hidden near forests, quietly shut down, with no official explanation. In these versions, the melon heads aren't ancient at all. They're the result of modern mistakes that were never acknowledged. And finally, the most comfortable explanation of all, that they're just folklore. Stories meant to scare children away from dangerous places. A warning disguised as a monster. Don't go into the woods. Don't wander abandoned roads. Don't ask questions. But here's the problem with that explanation. Modern sightings persist. People who've never heard the legend describe seeing something that matches it perfectly. Adults, teenagers, hikers, drivers, people with nothing to gain by lying, and everything to lose by admitting what they saw. And unlike classic ghost stories, melonhead encounters rarely feel nostalgic. They feel current, immediate, too physical to dismiss easily. Which raises an uncomfortable question. At what point does folklore become a cryptid? Is it when sightings continue across generations? When descriptions stay consistent without coordination? When explanations shift, but the figure itself remains? Or is a cryptid simply a story society isn't ready to name honestly yet? There's also a darker layer to consider. Some critics argue that the melonhead legends reflect fear of the other, of disability, illness, poverty, and isolation. That it turns real human suffering into something monstrous. That the horror doesn't come from the creatures in the woods, but from how easily people dehumanize what they don't understand. That may be the most unsettling part. Because even if the melonheads don't exist as literal beings, the fear they represent absolutely does. They refuse to die as a legend because they sit at the intersection of folklore, guilt, and secrecy. Because they ask us to look at what was hidden and who was abandoned. And because sometimes the scariest monsters are born from the question, what did we do and never admit to? In Connecticut, the woods don't just hide animals, they hide answers. Connecticut is often portrayed as orderly, educated, polite, a place where things are handled privately and stay that way. But beneath that image lies one of the most powerful and least discussed forces shaping the state's darker history: old money. Connecticut's wealth didn't arrive overnight. It accumulated slowly over centuries through land ownership, shipping, industry, and influence passed carefully from one generation to the next. And with that kind of longevity comes secrecy. Not the dramatic kind, but the practiced kind. The kind that knows how to keep its voice low. Many of Connecticut's oldest families own land that has never truly been opened to the public. Estates passed down intact, wooded acreage that never became parks, roads that look public but aren't. Some even maintain private cemeteries, burial grounds for family members only, tucked far away from town centers and official records. When death stays private, so do the stories surrounding it. Local folklore hints at tragedies that were never documented. Accidental deaths, labeled as illnesses, disappearance absorbed into family silence, estates where entire wings were closed off and never discussed again. These aren't the kind of hauntings that make good postcards. Tourist-friendly hauntings need access. They need openness. They need a place people are allowed to visit and photograph and speculate about. But Connecticut's most unsettling stories often exist behind gates, hedges, and legal boundaries. No ghost tours, no plaques, no souvenirs. Just land that feels heavy. People who've worked on these properties, caretakers, groundskeepers, domestic staff, sometimes speak of rooms no one enters, lights that turn on without explanation, or the persistent feeling of being watched while completely alone. But those stories rarely leave private conversations. When wealth controls the narrative, silence becomes policy. And that silence shapes the hauntings themselves. If spirits exist, what happens when they're never acknowledged? When no one tells their stories? When memory is confined to bloodlines instead of shared history? Some believe those hauntings don't seek attention. They don't announce themselves. They simply remain, woven into routine, accepted as part of the environment. A door that's always locked, a hallway no one uses, a rule no one remembers the origin of. This is why some of Connecticut's most disturbing hauntings never become legends. They don't need witnesses. They already have caretakers. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all of this, not every haunting wants to be discovered. Some are protected, preserved, and intentionally kept out of sight. Because in Connecticut, power doesn't just shape history. It decides what gets remembered. Conspiracy theories don't always grow in loud places. Sometimes they grow where things are too quiet. And few states are quieter about their federal presence than Connecticut. On the surface, Connecticut doesn't look like a hub of government power. There are no massive desert test sites, no sprawling, infamous bases that dominate the skyline, and yet, Connecticut sits uncomfortably close to some of the most important military and defense infrastructure in the country. Most of that centers around proximity. Connecticut is home to major military contractors, most notably General Dynamics Electric Boat, which has designed and built submarines for the U.S. Navy for generations. Nearby sits Naval Submarine Base New London, the primary East Coast submarine base. Submarines, by nature, encourage secrecy. You don't advertise stealth. You don't invite curiosity. And where secrecy is normal, conspiracy doesn't feel far behind. Rumors have circulated for decades about underground facilities scattered throughout the state, particularly in wooded or restricted areas. Facilities not marked on public maps. Buildings with no signage. Roads that appear to lead nowhere and are suddenly blocked with no trespassing signs that don't list an owner. Locals notice patterns. Restricted land that never changes hands. Structures that don't match their supposed purpose. Activity at odd hours. Convoys late at night. Low aircraft. Unexplained construction deep in forested areas. Official explanations, when offered at all, are vague. Storage, training, maintenance. Enough to satisfy paperwork, but not curiosity. And curiosity is where conspiracy thrives. Some theories focus on submarine-related research, experimental propulsion systems, deep-sea surveillance technology, or classified navigation systems tested far from public scrutiny. Others extend further, suggesting advanced surveillance programs, signal monitoring, or prototype technology, quietly developed away from major urban centers. Then, there are the darker rumors that certain facilities were never fully decommissioned, that older Cold War sites still exist beneath the surface, that some research required isolation, not for safety, but for secrecy. What gives these theories traction isn't evidence, it's atmosphere. Connecticut doesn't deny much. It simply doesn't explain. There are no loud denials, no dramatic whistleblowers, just an ongoing absence of information. And in some ways, that's more unsettling than confirmation. People who live nearby describe a strange normalcy to it all. You grow up knowing certain places are off limits. Certain questions don't get answers. Certain areas aren't meant to be explored. And after a while, you stop asking. Which leads to the most unsettling idea at the heart of this conspiracy. That there is truly nothing to see, because whatever exists was designed not to be seen at all. No cover-up scandal, no shocking reveal, just systems functioning exactly as intended. Invisible, efficient, unquestioned. In a state already shaped by secrecy, old money, and private land, the idea of hidden federal presence doesn't feel outrageous. It feels consistent. Because sometimes the scariest conspiracies aren't about what's hidden. They're about how easily we accept not knowing. Not all hauntings are about what moves or what screams. Some hauntings are about what stays. Connecticut is a state layered with history. Centuries of settlement, conflict, industry, and family life. And with each generation, certain events leave an imprint. Not a physical one, not a mark you can see, but a psychological one. Generational trauma imprinted on land is subtle. It doesn't manifest as poltergeists or violent apparitions. It manifests as tension, unease, a heaviness that lingers in houses, streets, and forests long after people who created it are gone. Some paranormal researchers distinguish between residual hauntings and intelligent hauntings. Residual hauntings are echoes, replaying moments of fear, grief, or violence, like a record stuck on repeat. They aren't aware of you. They cannot interact. They just exist, quietly reminding anyone nearby that something happened here. Intelligent hauntings, by contrast, are aware. They respond. They move and watch. In Connecticut, many hauntings fall closer to residual. But there's a catch. Even echoes can feel like observation. Visitors often report a sense of being watched, of not belonging, of eyes following them across empty rooms or foggy fields. These hauntings don't strike. They don't chase. They wait. And that waiting is enough. Silence becomes the medium of fear. Not loud, sudden events, but quiet spaces where the imagination grows restless. Empty hallways, unlit graveyards, abandoned villages, dense forest paths. Places where every sound is amplified and every shadow seems intentional. Connecticut's ghosts are watchful rather than violent, patient rather than explosive. They remind us history doesn't disappear, that pain, grief, and fear can linger long after a body is gone. And sometimes, the most unsettling presence is the one that never announces itself. It's there, always there. You just have to notice. Because in a place like Connecticut, the land remembers more than we realize. And sometimes, those memories are the only things left to haunt us. Connecticut doesn't scream. It doesn't announce its hauntings with fireworks or sudden chaos. It waits. It waits in the shadowed hallways of old estates, in the fog rolling off the coast, in the silence of abandoned villages and the deep woods. Horror here is subtle, polished, hidden behind manners, behind history, behind trees that have watched centuries pass. As we close tonight's episode, take a moment to reflect. Think of the places where you felt watched, not threatened, not in danger, but observed. The spaces where something seemed alive, even if no one was there. A hallway you hesitated to walk down. A street at night that felt heavier than it should. A forest that seemed to breathe around you. Those feelings matter. They connect us to history, to memory, and to the unseen threads of the world around us. If you have a story like that, a moment when you felt the inexplicable, the unexplained, or simply watched, we'd love to hear it. You can submit your stories to hexes, haunts, and howls at gmail.com. Again, that's hexes, haunts, and howls, all one word, at gmail.com. All stories will remain anonymous. Your experiences become part of a larger tapestry of haunted America, helping us understand not just the places, but the feelings that linger long after the events themselves. Thank you for joining me tonight as we wander through Connecticut. Its witch trials, abandoned villages, coastal ghosts, cryptids, old wealth, and hidden secrets. Next time, we continue our journey through Delaware, exploring new places where history, mystery, and the unseen collide. Until then, stay aware, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the quietest places have the most to say. Thank you for listening to Hexes, Haunts, and Howls. I'm your host, Cupcake. Until next time, stay sweet.